We're good to go, and welcome. This is Random Thoughts from County Antrim, and I'm your host, David McDonnell. My half hour every Sunday night of some stories, yarns, historical stuff, and whatever else random comes into my mind. Now, I hinted last week about today's story, which I've entitled, it's a true story, but I've entitled it A Well-Known, Little-Known Irish Man. And this story will start in Ireland and actually even in Scotland and take us to America and then back to Ireland. But before I do, I want to tell you a little news on the home front. I do not have coronavirus. Now, this is the second time I've been tested. I was tested in June. I didn't have any symptoms then. I just was about to travel. I live in northern Michigan. I was going to travel to southern Michigan and visit a relative who had traveled, and I just thought it'd be a good idea to get tested, and that's when I discovered it's not easy to get a test. You have to be sick, and I wasn't sick then, and I scouted around, and I finally found a place that was doing, I think it was doing a pilot program of some sort. It was looking for people who met a certain criteria, age, pre-existing conditions, and whatever. And I filled out the application online and was accepted for the test. And I got tested, and I got the results like 8 days later, and it was negative, which was the good news. Bad news is by then, of course, I had already traveled downstate and already visited my traveling relative, so the test didn't do me a lot of good in that regard. But I also got tested again this week. And this week I did have symptoms. I had this nagging cough, and I had muscle aches and cold-like, flu-like symptoms, and it's been around for weeks and weeks. So I finally decided to see a doctor. So I went to a local walk-in clinic, and walk-in clinic is kind of a misnomer. It was really more of a drive-in clinic. You drive into the clinic, you call them from the parking lot, you come out, take your temperature, they give you a clipboard to fill out stuff. And then they took back the clipboard, and they brought out, asked me for my driver's license, insurance information, took that back inside. Later returned, and they swabbed my nostrils with whatever chemical was in there. And all the while I was in my car with the window rolled down. And it was quite a while later before they came back to me and said that I could now leave my car and go to the shed in the back of the clinic. So I got out of my car, walked out to the back of the clinic, and there's this huge tent, a big white tent, and underneath it there was a bunch of medical staff scurrying around and medical equipment all over the place. And next to the tent was a shed. And it's the kind of shed you see at Home Depot and Lowe's outside the front door, and you buy it and they pick it up, put it on a truck, and deliver it to your backyard, and you fill it up with stuff. And that shed was the doctor's office. That's what a doctor's office looks like in the midst of a pandemic. And the shed didn't even have electricity. They had an extension cord running from the inside of the clinic outside to the shed, and in the shed it plugged into a power strip with all kinds of different equipment plugged into the power strip. I don't know how it didn't blow up, but somehow it didn't. Then a nurse came in, took my vitals. Doctor came in, checked out a whole variety of things, did what you'd expect at a doctor's visit, except that it was in a shed. And I think my blood oxygen levels were low, and I was kind of short of breath, and I had other kind of symptoms. And the doctor told me, he said, I don't know if you have the virus or not, but you have something wrong with you, and he gave me some scripts. And I've been on those scripts since, whatever that was, Tuesday, and I have to admit I'm feeling a bit better. But the virus test was Tuesday, and then I get a call on Friday. It says I'm negative, which means I do not have the virus. So we'll see. That's 2 tests and 2 negatives. We'll see how that goes. I'm not one of the numbers you see flipping on the corner of your screen for the number of increased infections there are out there, which that number, unfortunately, has been going way, way too high. So that's that story. So now I'm going to give you the other story, and it's going to date back a little bit to the 16th, 17th century, and I'll kind of fly forward into the 19th and then 20th, even 21st. But back in the 16th, 17th century, the English vigorously sought to subdue the Irish clans. The Irish resisted, and there was a war, a series of wars, clan wars against the English, and each one led to an Irish defeat. And with each defeat, the English confiscated Irish lands, and with that, there was yet another rebellion, and then more confiscations, to the point where the Irish didn't own any land in Ireland. It was all owned by the English, because the lands were confiscated. Now, that took a couple of centuries. I just covered a couple of centuries and a couple of centuries. But the effect of it was that virtually all the land in Ireland was owned by English landlords and leased to Irish tenants. Now, these lands, they were referred to by the English as plantations. Not because they were planting crops, because the plan was to plant people. The problem with Ireland from the English perspective was not Ireland. The problem was the Irish. If the English could simply get rid of the Irish and replace them with English, then Ireland would be just this wonderful, wonderful place. Now, at the same time that was going on, it's mainly the 1600s, late 1500s, but mainly the 1600s, and carried on into the 1700s. Same time this was going on, the same thing was going on in North America. The English were bringing plantations to Virginia, to the Carolinas, Georgia, and elsewhere. And the problem in North America was much the same. The Native Americans were already there. Now, when the plantations were opened in both North America and in Ireland, most English settlers wanted nothing to do with Ireland. Those English who were inclined to leave England jumped across the Atlantic and moved to North America. The plantations, though, in Ireland were attractive, though, to many Scots. There was widespread poverty in Scotland, and Scottish farms were often small and unproductive. Scottish tenant farmers were being evicted. The large landowners preferred having their lands occupied by sheep than by Scottish tenant farmers. So many Scots moved to Ireland, to some of these plantations, all over Ireland, but much higher concentration in Northern Ireland. Some of them became tenant farmers in Ireland. Some became merchants in the towns that were growing in Ireland. But many more Scots moved directly. They skipped Ireland. They moved directly from Scotland to North America, the United States or Canada. So I want to tell you about two Scottish families who moved from Scotland to Ireland. Both of these were from the Scottish lowlands. Lived for many generations in the lowlands of Scotland. One of those families is the Hutchinsons. Now, the Hutchinson family moved from Scotland to Ireland in the 1600s. And Cyrus Hutchinson was born in 1690 in Carrickfergus. It's in County Antrim. And there he married a woman named Margaret Lyle, who was likewise born in County Antrim. And her parents were likewise born in Scotland. So Cyrus and Margaret were married. They had a daughter named Elizabeth, who was born in Ireland in 1737. Now, another family, the Jacksons, they also left Scotland in the late 1600s. Hugh Scotland became a linen weaver in Carrickfergus. And Hugh was born in Ireland, but his parents were born in Scotland. Now, Hugh Jackson had 4 sons, all born in Ireland. His third son was named Andrew Jackson. Now, Andrew married Elizabeth Hutchinson. So now you have the merger of the Jacksons and the Hutchinsons. They were married in 1760. And they likewise lived in Carrickfergus, Andrew and Elizabeth Jackson. And they had 3 sons, Hugh, Robert, and Andrew. Andrew being the youngest. Now, the entire family moved to the United States in 1767. And if you know your math, you know your history, that's just a few years before the American Revolution. Now, Hugh and Robert, the 2 oldest sons, were born in Ireland. Young Andrew, the youngest of the 3 sons, his birthplace is a bit of a mystery. There's some evidence that suggests that he too was born in Ireland, in Carrickfergus. Other evidence says he was born in North Carolina after his family made the trek across the Atlantic. There's even a hint that he was born aboard ship somewhere over the Atlantic as they were headed from Ireland to North America, North Carolina in particular. But Andrew was born the youngest of the 3 sons. Now, the father Andrew, was died before the American Revolution. Not sure of the cause. I saw some references at one point in time, but I'm not sure how accurate they are. The eldest son, Hugh, enlisted in the war when the Revolutionary War began, and he died of heat exhaustion while serving in an American regiment in the Revolutionary War. Now, the middle son, Robert, and the youngest son, Andrew, also served in the Revolutionary War. Young Andrew was only 13 years old when he enlisted in the Army. And sometime during the war, Robert and Andrew were captured by the British, and both were imprisoned. Middle son, Robert Jackson, died of smallpox while in prison during the war. Young Andrew survived the war, but he carried a scar from being beaten in the head by a British officer while he was in prison. Now, Andrew's mother, Elizabeth, died of cholera during the war. So young Andrew Jackson, was the family's only survivor of the American Revolutionary War. Now, most of you know the rest of the story. I think you do. Andrew studied law. He moved west to Tennessee. He was elected to the state legislature. He fought in many Indian wars. He became a general, first in the militia and later the United States Army. He became an American hero when he led the American forces who defeated the British in the Battle of New Orleans. He was later elected governor of Tennessee and then president of the United States. He's our 7th president. Today, I think Andrew Jackson is most famous as being the figure on the $20 bill. I'd pull one out for you, but I don't carry cash anymore. Everything I put on debit card or credit card, I never carry cash. But if I did, and if I had a $20 bill, it would have the likeness of Andrew Jackson on it. Now, Andrew Jackson, he's the first Irish-American president. But he's not really thought of as a hero in Ireland, and it's not because anybody has anything against him. He's just not thought about much at all. I mean, he's a well-known figure, but it's little known that he was an Irish man. So then I'm going to fast forward. That's the early 18th century. Now I'm going to fast forward to 1943. And by then, in beginning 1942 and heavily in 1943 and early 1944, in the midst of World War II, there were several million American troops in the British Isles. Tons of equipment, planes, tanks, jeeps, anything imaginable, ammunition, supplies for all of the above. And all was being shipped to England for then the campaigns in Africa and Italy and whatever, but also preparing for the invasion of Normandy, the invasion of France, D-Day. Now those men were dispersed. They weren't in a single base. That wouldn't have been terribly, several million men. It would be terribly prudent to have them all at one place. They were dispersed all over the United Kingdom. And there was a unit of United States Rangers who played a big role in the Normandy invasion, who were stationed near Carrickfergus in Northern Ireland. And while there, they were somewhat surprised to discover that there was an old home on Bonnybefore Street in Carrickfergus that was the family home of President Andrew Jackson. Now, it had been the home of one family or the other for a couple hundred years since, and it was a bit in disrepair, but it was the family home of a former president. Now, despite the very long hours these troops were spending in training and getting ready, a lot of them devoted their off-duty hours to restoring the Jackson home. And today the house is almost in its original state. It's the same, it looks the same when you go through it, supposedly, as it did when the Jackson family lived there. Behind it, actually, there's there's a building behind the Jackson home, which is somewhat nondescript, almost like a pole barn. And it's not the exterior of the building that's important, but inside there's a museum. This is the backyard of the Jackson home, but inside of this building in the back is a museum devoted to the Rangers and their role in both in and around Carrickfergus in training and their role in the Normandy invasion. So let's take the story back to the United States a bit, and then we'll return to Ireland. Andrew Jackson, he's revered by many, and he served 2 terms. He was our 7th president. He was our first president who was not from Virginia or Massachusetts. He was from the frontier of Tennessee. He was a spokesman for the common man, and respected as it's kind of a gruff spokesman for the everyday American. And that phrase for the common man is probably an accurate phrase, as long as you understand it to be that he was a spokesman for the common white man. Because he didn't do anything for black Americans at all, and he rose in the military ranks of the militia in the U.S. Army from his actions in the Indian Wars. And he was particularly brutal in his treatment of Native Americans in those wars. But he was most brutal in his treatment of Native Americans, not as a soldier, but as President of the United States. Now, in the 1820s, the white settlers and the native tribes in southeastern part of the country kind of coexisted in relative peace. The U.S. government negotiated with these tribal groups and entered into treaties and treated the tribes as if they were sovereign nations. And there were many people, including Andrew Jackson, who thought that was wrong, that they shouldn't be treated as sovereign nations. They lived within the states, and negotiations with the tribal groups infringed upon the sovereignty of the American states. But of course, the whole affair didn't have anything to do with states' rights or with Indian tribal sovereignty. It had to do with white settlers who wanted Indian land. Now, in one of his, as president, one of his State of the Union addresses, Andrew Jackson, advocated for the forceful removal of these Native American tribes from the Southeast, the Carolinas, Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, Florida, and the relocation of these tribes west of the Mississippi River. And Congress responded with the Indian Removal Act. And it was bitterly debated, but it was narrowly passed. And with the act, Native Americans, and I'm speaking primarily of the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Creek, the Cherokee, Seminole, and some other tribal groups, were forcibly evicted from their lands in the southeast part of the country and moved to the Indian Territory, west of the Mississippi, which was ultimately Oklahoma. Now, in all, there were about 46,000 Indians who were removed, freeing up millions of acres of land for white settlers. And this ultimately led to the cotton cultivation in that region, and with that, the expansion of slavery but it was preceded by the removal of the Native Americans from that region. Now, the route from the southeast part of the country to Oklahoma is called the Trail of Tears. The Indians walked from far away as Georgia to Oklahoma, and some of that was taken over the winter, the coldest months of the year. And they were guarded by federal troops, and they were herded into temporary quarters and along the route, and communicable diseases spread like crazy, which you should understand in this era of the virus. There's very little provisions made for food along the route, and many of the Native Americans on this trail forcibly removed from their homes. Many of them died of starvation. Now, the death count is difficult to imagine, to count. I'm trying to look up my notes here. I think as many as 46,000 Native Americans were moved. And some estimates are a third of them died along the way. It's difficult to characterize this as anything else but ethnic cleansing, as we called it in the 20th century. And before I bring the story back to Ireland, I just want to mention a little bit, just a wee bit, about the Choctaw Nation. The Choctaws inhabited much of what is now Mississippi and Alabama. And about 12,000 of them were forcibly removed in the 1830s. And somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 of them died en route to Oklahoma. And most of those deaths were from cholera. And they were moved to the southeast corner of Oklahoma, and smallpox and other diseases hit that region shortly thereafter. And the Choctaws continued for a generation after that, and certainly further, suffering through starvation and famine and disease. Now, a decade later, this is 1830s, when the Trail of Tears took place. A decade later, famine and disease hit another part of the world, and of course I'm talking about Ireland. Ireland suffered through the Great Hunger, the blight of the potato, in the 1840s, last half of the 1840s. It's about a decade after the Trail of Tears. And that was a period when about 1.5 million Irish died of starvation and starvation-related diseases. The British government did precious little to help out the Irish at the time, and much of what they did was kind of counterproductive. But aid, and that I may talk about that some other podcast. But aid began to pour in all across the world. It was may have been history's first worldwide relief effort. Money was raised all over and sent to Ireland, and most of that ended up with the Quakers, who set up soup kitchens and other aid for the sick and starving. Now, among those who sent aid, the Choctaws. A decade after the Trail of Tears, when they were suffering through their own degradation, starvation, famine, disease, genocide perhaps, the Choctaw Nation raised $170 for Irish relief. Now, I have no idea what $170 is in 2020 money, in modern day currency, but I'm certain the Choctaws did not have $170 to spare. But spare they did, and sent the money to Ireland, and Ireland has not forgotten. There's a wonderful monument now in County Cork. It's called the Kindred Spirits Choctaw Monument, and it's basically 9 stainless steel eagle feathers arrayed in a circle. Each one of these feathers is 20 foot tall, and it's arrayed in a circle so it looks like a bowl, and it represents the gift of food. And it's quite beautiful, and I wish I could just show you or photograph it, but what I suggest is you just Google it. Google Choctaw, Chocktaw, Choctaw Irish famine, you'll see images of this monument. It's just a wonderful, wonderful scene, and a thank you from the Irish people to the Choctaw Nation. So that's my story. I told you I was going to talk about a president, and I thought I'd talk about a lot of them, but I figured instead I would give you a little more detail about one American president with Irish roots. And this one president is on the $20 bill, and if I had to make a bet, I think he's going to be replaced by someone else sometime in the future, for reasons which you might figure out. So that's the end of my podcast. Please take a look at my website, clandonald.net. Tomorrow, supposedly, we're going to get the release of my brand new website. It's supposed to be released tomorrow. I'm going to spend most of next week adding data to it once I learn how to do it. But the design, I think, is brilliant. I think you'll like it. It'll be real easy to maneuver through. Send me an email at clandonald@gmail.com. Take a look at my books, Clandonald and Buy the Horse of Guinness. I actually started this week in the midst of my coronavirus test. Started my third book. I hope I can make some progress on it over the next couple of months and have something that looks good and I'll be able to release sometime in 2021. But in the meantime, thank you very much for joining us. See you next week. This is David McDonnell, Random Thoughts from County Antrim on whatever date this is. I didn't start with this. This is November 15th, 2020. Goodbye.